On the night of September 3rd, 1940, a small boat approached the coast of Kent in the darkness. Two men climbed out onto the beach near Dungeness, a flat, featureless stretch of shingle on the southeastern tip of England, chosen for exactly the qualities that made it uncomfortable. Remote, unwatched, the kind of coast where nothing happened. The men were German agents, trained by the Abwehr, and dispatched to Britain with a wireless transmitter, a code book, a cover story, and instructions to report on British military dispositions, morale, and the state of preparations for a German invasion that was, at that moment, still considered a serious possibility. They were arrested within hours, not because British coastal defenses were particularly alert that night, and not because the agents had made an obvious mistake. They were arrested because MI5, the British Security Service, had been waiting for them. Not those specific men on that specific beach on that specific night, but waiting in the broader sense, with a system, a procedure, and a growing understanding that the German intelligence effort against Britain was something that could be not merely defended against, but captured and turned. The organization that would do the turning was called the 20 Committee. The name came from the Roman numeral XX, a double cross. The committee had been formed in January 1941 under the chairmanship of John Cecil Masterman, an Oxford historian whose peacetime career had given him no obvious preparation for running a wartime deception operation, and who turned out to be precisely the right person for the job. Masterman understood that the 20 Committee's task was not simply counter-espionage, catching German spies and imprisoning them. It was something more ambitious and more dangerous. Catching German spies, turning them, and using them to control what the German intelligence services believed about Britain. The ambition required a specific condition: completeness. A partial double-cross system, one that controlled some German agents while others remained free to report accurately, was worse than no system at all. If the Germans received true reports from some agents and false reports from others, they could compare the two and identify the discrepancies. The false reports would be exposed. The double agents would be compromised. The system would collapse. Complete control meant that every German agent in Britain had to be either captured or turned. No exceptions, no gaps. A single free agent, sending accurate information to Hamburg or Berlin, could unravel everything. By the end of 1940, MI5 believed it had achieved this. The evidence was necessarily indirect. You could not prove the absence of something you hadn't found, but the signals intelligence from Bletchley Park, which had broken the Enigma cipher used by the Abwehr, allowed MI5 to monitor German intelligence traffic and identify when agents were expected to arrive, what they had been tasked to find, and what reports their handlers were receiving. When an agent arrived and was not captured, Bletchley would eventually show his reports reaching Hamburg. When every agent who arrived was captured, and Bletchley showed no unexpected reports reaching Hamburg, the conclusion was available. The system was complete. It was a conclusion that required constant maintenance. New agents arrived, new networks were attempted. Each one had to be identified, intercepted, and either turned or silenced before it could compromise the agents already in place. The men who ran this system, Masterman, his case officers, the handlers who sat across from turned agents and managed the delicate fiction of their continued loyalty to Germany, were doing something that had no real precedent in the history of intelligence. They were not merely deceiving the enemy, they were becoming the enemy's intelligence service, deciding what Germany knew about Britain, controlling the picture of reality that German planners used to make their decisions. What they decided Germany should believe about Britain in 1940 was carefully calibrated. Not so alarming that the Germans would be deterred from operations that MI5 needed to observe. Not so reassuring that they would accelerate plans that Britain was not ready to face. By 1943, the calibration had a new purpose. The invasion of France was coming. The Germans knew it was coming. What they did not know was where it would land, when it would come, and how many men it would bring. The 20 Committee was about to tell them. The Abwehr had been confident in its British network. This confidence was not unreasonable given what the Abwehr knew, which was that its agents were filing reports, that their wireless transmissions were reaching Hamburg on schedule, that the information they provided was being assessed, collated, and forwarded to the departments that needed it. The system appeared to be functioning. Agents were in place. Intelligence was flowing. From the outside, from the perspective of an intelligence organization receiving regular reports from its field assets, there was no obvious reason to suspect that anything was wrong. The problem was that the confidence rested entirely on what the agents were reporting, and the agents were reporting what MI5 had decided they should report. The Abwehr's structural weakness was one that afflicted intelligence services more broadly. The difficulty of verifying information through channels that were themselves potentially compromised. If an agent's reports were the primary source of information about a given subject, and the agent was under enemy control, the intelligence service had no independent means of checking whether the reports were accurate. It could compare reports from different agents, but if multiple agents were under the same control, their reports would be consistent with each other because the same organization was producing all of them. By 1943, MI5 controlled enough of the Abwehr's British network that this was precisely the situation. The agents who were supposed to be checking each other were all reporting to the same handlers in London, who were reporting to the same 20 committee, which was deciding what all of them would say. The Abwehr also had a structural problem specific to its position within the Nazi state. German intelligence in 1943 was not a single organization with a clear chain of command, but a competition between multiple agencies with overlapping jurisdictions, conflicting interests, and different relationships with the political leadership. The Abwehr, under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, was the military intelligence service. The SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence arm of the SS, was a separate organization under Walter Schellenberg, answerable to Himmler rather than the Wehrmacht. Both produced intelligence assessments. Both competed for access to Hitler. Neither had strong institutional incentives to report findings that contradicted what the political leadership wanted to hear. Hitler's intelligence preferences were well understood within both organizations. He believed that American military capability was fundamentally limited by what he considered the racial and cultural inadequacies of American society. A democracy, he argued, could not sustain the kind of losses that a serious war required, and its population would demand peace before the military situation justified it. He believed that American industry, while productive, was manufacturing for quantity at the expense of quality. He believed that the American soldier, untested and soft, would prove inferior to the German soldier in sustained combat. These beliefs were not entirely without foundation in 1942, when American forces were new to the war, and their performance in early engagements like Kasserine Pass had given German commanders reason for confidence. By 1944, the foundation had eroded, but the beliefs persisted, in part because the intelligence that reached Hitler tended to confirm them. An Abwehr report that told Hitler what he already believed was a report that moved smoothly through the system. A report that contradicted his beliefs required an officer willing to stake his career, and increasingly his life, on the argument that the Führer was wrong. The institutional pressure was not toward accuracy, it was toward confirmation. MI5 understood this. The 20 committees' reports, fed through the double agents, were calibrated not only to be believable on their own terms, but to be believable to the specific audience that would receive them, an audience whose prior beliefs shaped what it was willing to accept as true. The system did not need to be perfect. It needed to be good enough that the Germans would not look for the gaps. And the Germans, confident in their network and predisposed to believe what they were being told, were not looking very hard. What they were about to be told about the size of the Allied invasion force, its location, its timing, and the dispositions of American armies that did not exist, would shape the decisions they made in the summer of 1944. The 20 Committee had been preparing the story for over a year. Juan Pujol Garcia had decided to spy against Germany before anyone asked him to. He was a Spaniard, born in Barcelona in 1912, who had spent the Civil War navigating between the Republican and nationalist sides with the specific agility of a man who trusted neither and survived both. By 1940, watching what Germany was doing to Europe, He had arrived at a conclusion that he described in his later memoir with characteristic directness. He wanted to help defeat Nazism. Not out of loyalty to Britain, he had no particular connection to Britain, but out of a personal conviction that the thing happening in Europe was wrong and that someone should do something about it. He decided the something should be him. His first approach was to the British. He contacted the British Embassy in Madrid and offered his services as a spy. The British were not interested. A walk-in volunteer with no credentials, no access, and no track record was not an asset. He was a liability, a possible plant, a distraction. They turned him away. He went to the Germans instead, not because he had changed his mind about who he wanted to help, but because he understood that the way to become useful to British intelligence was to first become convincing to German intelligence. If the Abwehr believed he was a genuine agent, he would have something to offer MI5. Without the Abwehr's trust, he had nothing. The Germans were more receptive. He told them he was pro-Nazi, anti-British, and willing to travel to England to build an intelligence network. The Abwehr trained him in the basics of clandestine communication, secret ink, codes, cover stories, and dispatched him on his mission. He went to Lisbon instead of London, found a copy of a tourist guide to Britain, a railway timetable, and a reference book on the British military, and began filing reports on his fictitious network of sub-agents. The reports were detailed, confident, and entirely invented. He described agents he had recruited, a Portuguese businessman who traveled to Britain for commercial reasons, a Venezuelan student in Glasgow, a Swiss businessman with access to military figures. None of them existed. Their information came from the tourist guide, the timetable, and Garcia's own imagination, which turned out to be well suited to the task of producing intelligence reports that sounded like intelligence reports. The Abwehr believed him, not immediately and not without skepticism, but the reports were consistent. The sub-agents were plausible. The information, while not always militarily significant, was the kind of granular detail that genuine field agents produced, the kind that was too specific and too mundane to be invented. Except that it was invented. Garcia was simply good enough at inventing it that the Abwehr's professional skepticism did not survive contact with his professional confidence. By 1942, the Abwehr considered him one of its most valuable assets in Britain. He was running a network of 14 fictitious agents across England, Scotland, and Wales. He was filing regular reports by wireless and courier. He was receiving payment for the expenses of a network that did not exist, which he spent on his own living costs in Lisbon. He was, from the Abwehr's perspective, a model agent. Productive, reliable, apparently committed. MI5 had been watching him since early 1942. The Bletchley intercepts had shown reports from an agent in Britain whose information did not match any known double agent's output, which meant either a free agent operating outside the system or something more unusual. When analysts traced the reports more carefully, they found inconsistencies that a genuine agent would not have produced, references to locations that did not match each other geographically, details that came from published sources, a pattern of information that looked like research rather than observation. They sent an officer to Lisbon to find him. What the officer found was a small, precise man in a rented room, surrounded by reference books and files of his own manufacture, running the Abwehr's most productive British network entirely by himself from Portugal. MI5 brought him to London in April 1942. They gave him the code name Garbo, after Greta Garbo, on the theory that he was the greatest actor they had ever encountered. In London, Garbo became the centerpiece of something larger than himself. MI5 assigned him a case officer, Tomás Harris, a half-Spanish art dealer who had been recruited into intelligence work and whose bilingual fluency made him the natural partner for a Spaniard whose English was limited. Harris and Garcia worked together for the rest of the war in a collaboration that their colleagues described as the most productive bilateral relationship in the history of British intelligence. Harris managed the operational details, the timing of transmissions, the coordination with other double agents, the consistency of the cover stories. Garcia managed the performance, the voice, the texture, the specific quality of a man that the Abwehr in Hamburg had come to trust. The Abwehr trusted Garbo because he had built the trust before MI5 found him. This was the operational fact that made him uniquely valuable. Most double agents had been caught and turned. Their relationship with their German handlers began in compromise, with the Germans believing they had a willing asset and the British managing the fiction. Garbo's relationship with the Abwehr had begun in genuine initiative. He had approached them, convinced them, built the network, established the track record. The trust was not manufactured by MI5. It had been manufactured by Garcia himself, out of reference books and imagination in a rented room in Lisbon. What MI5 added was direction. The reports that Garcia had been filing from Lisbon, plausible, detailed, invented, were replaced by reports that were plausible, detailed, invented, and strategically calibrated. The information Garcia's fictional subagents provided was now chosen not by what seemed believable, but by what the 20 Committee needed the Abwehr to believe. The machinery of deception that Garcia had built independently became, under MI5's direction, the primary instrument through which Allied strategic intentions were communicated to German intelligence. The Abwehr's response to this machinery illustrated the problem at the heart of all intelligence assessment. They had no independent means of verifying what Garbo told them. They had no other agents whose reports they could compare with his, because the other agents whose reports they were receiving were also controlled by MI5, and their reports were also calibrated by the 20 Committee. The internal consistency of the German picture of Britain, the fact that multiple sources told similar stories, was not evidence that the picture was accurate. It was evidence that the organization producing the picture was competent. MI5 was very competent. By early 1944, Garbo's network had grown to 14 subagents, still all fictional, still all maintained by Garcia and Harris in offices in London, who between them provided coverage of military dispositions across Britain. The network's output was the primary source through which the Abwehr assessed the Allied order of battle. Which divisions were where, which ports were active, which commanders were associated with which formations. What the network told the Abwehr about the Allied order of battle was controlled by the 20 Committee. The 20 Committee had decided that the Abwehr should believe the Allied invasion force was substantially larger than it actually was, that the divisions assembling in southeastern England, opposite the Pas de Calais, represented the main invasion force rather than a deception, and that the forces assembling in the west, which would actually land in Normandy, were a diversion. To make this believable, the network needed to provide specific, detailed, internally consistent reporting on the fictional southeastern force. Garbo provided it. The Abwehr received reports on unit movements, supply concentrations, command appointments, and training activities that collectively described an army preparing to cross the Channel at its narrowest point. The army did not exist. The reports did. On June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day, Garbo attempted to warn his German handlers that the invasion was imminent. The warning was genuine. He had been authorized by MI5 to send it because the timing, arriving after the fleet had already sailed, too late to effect the German response, would make him appear to be the Abwehr's most reliable asset, the agent who had found the information when everyone else had missed it. The transmission was delayed. The Germans received it after the landings had already begun. They concluded that Garbo's network was even more valuable than they had realized. What happened next? The message Garbo sent on June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, would be the most consequential intelligence report of the war. The 1st United States Army Group did not exist. It had a headquarters, a commander, a staff, radio call signs, vehicle markings, and a location, a concentration of forces in southeastern England, opposite the Pas de Calais, the narrowest crossing of the English Channel. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed it. German signals intelligence monitored its radio traffic. Garbo's subagents filed reports on its movements. The Abwehr's order of battle analysts incorporated it into their assessments of Allied strength. The Army Group's commander was General George S. Patton. Patton was real. His assignment to FUSAG, the 1st United States Army Group, was also real, in the sense that he actually traveled to the southeastern headquarters actually appeared at functions where he could be observed, and actually allowed himself to be associated with the formation in ways that the Germans would notice. He was the ideal choice for the role, the American general whom German commanders most respected, the officer whose presence at the head of a formation was the strongest possible signal that the formation was serious. The formation was not serious. It was Operation Fortitude South, the deception designed to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion would cross at Calais rather than Normandy. The plan required the Germans to believe three things simultaneously. First, that the Allied invasion force was substantially larger than it actually was, that in addition to the forces actually assembling in the west of England for the Normandy landing, there existed a second, larger army group in the southeast preparing the main assault. Second, that Patton commanded this main force, which implied that the Normandy landing, when it came, was a diversion rather than the primary effort, because the Germans did not believe the Allies would waste Patton on a diversion. Third, that even after Normandy, the threat to Calais remained real, that the divisions held back for the Pas-de-Calais crossing would still come, and that German reserves committed to Normandy would be unavailable to meet them. Each of these beliefs required maintenance. They could not simply be asserted and left to stand. They had to be supported by evidence, the kind of granular, specific, self-consistent evidence that trained intelligence analysts found convincing precisely because it was the kind of evidence that genuine military preparations produced. The evidence was manufactured at a scale that had no precedent. Inflatable tanks and artillery pieces were positioned where German reconnaissance aircraft could photograph them. Fake landing craft were anchored in the rivers and harbors of the southeast. Radio units drove through the countryside broadcasting the traffic patterns of formations that weren't there, the logistics queries, the administrative signals, the routine communications of armies that existed only in the transmissions. The BBC broadcast coded messages to fictional resistance contacts. The press was managed to produce stories consistent with the deception, and Garbo's subagents filed their reports. The reports were the most important element, not because they were more convincing than the physical evidence, but because they were the channel through which the physical evidence was interpreted. A German analyst looking at aerial photographs of southeastern England saw vehicles and equipment. Garbo's reports told him what those vehicles and equipment meant, which units they belonged to, which commanders were associated with them, what their state of readiness suggested about their timeline. Without the reports, the photographs were ambiguous. With the reports, they confirmed what the Abwehr was already being told by other means. The 20 Committee understood that consistent deception was more convincing than perfect deception. A picture of reality that had occasional imperfections, small details that didn't quite fit, minor inconsistencies that could be explained by the fog of intelligence collection, was more believable than a picture that was too clean. Real intelligence was imperfect. The deception needed to look like real intelligence. Garbo's network provided imperfection on demand. Subagents occasionally missed details. Reports were sometimes delayed. Information arrived in fragments that required assembly. The Abwehr analysts who worked with this material were doing what intelligence analysts always do, building a coherent picture from incomplete evidence. The picture they built was the one the 20 Committee wanted them to build. By the spring of 1944, the German assessment of Allied intentions was substantially what Operation Fortitude had designed it to be. On June 9, 1944, 3 days after the Normandy landings had begun, Garbo sent the most important message of the war. The landings had happened. The beachhead was established. German forces in Normandy were engaged with Allied troops who were fighting to expand their foothold. The question that the German High Command was urgently trying to answer was whether Normandy was the main invasion or a diversion, whether the correct response was to commit the reserve panzer divisions to Normandy and destroy the beachhead, or to hold them back for the Calais landing that might still be coming. Garbo's message told them to hold. The message, drafted by Garcia and Harris and authorized by the 20 Committee after careful deliberation, argued from the evidence of the fictional FUSAG order of battle that the Normandy landing was precisely what it appeared to be, a diversion. The main force under Patton remained in the southeast. Its preparations had not changed. The concentration of forces opposite Calais was intact. A commander with Patton's reputation and the best divisions in the Allied inventory would not be held in reserve for a secondary operation. The logical conclusion was that Normandy was the feint and Calais was the real blow. The message reached Hitler's headquarters the following morning. Hitler read it. He found it convincing. Convincing enough that he rescinded the order releasing 2 SS Panzer divisions that had already been directed toward Normandy. The divisions stopped. They turned around. They waited for the Calais landing that was not coming. The Allied beachhead, which in those first days was fragile enough that a concentrated armored counterattack might have driven it back into the sea, was not counterattacked with full force. The reserve that could have been committed was held back by an intelligence assessment produced by a Spaniard with a case officer in a London office building. The Abwehr's confidence in Garbo was so complete that his June 9th message was treated not as one input among many, but as definitive intelligence from a trusted source. This was the endpoint of the trust that Garcia had built in Lisbon, that MI5 had maintained in London, that the 20 Committee had invested over 2 years of careful management. The investment paid in the specific currency of Hitler's decision on June 10, 1944. German forces waited at Calais for 7 weeks. The 15th Army, 15 divisions that might have been committed to Normandy, remained in position opposite a crossing that the Allies had no intention of making. The Pas de Calais was defended. Normandy was where the war was being decided. The 15th Army watched the sea. The operational consequence was visible in the fighting that followed. The Allied breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra in late July, succeeded against a German defense that was weaker than it should have been, depleted by the commitment of forces to Normandy that had come too late and too gradually because the reserve had been held back for a threat that did not exist. The gap between the forces Germany committed to Normandy and the forces it could have committed was in significant part the product of what Garbo's subagents had reported. The Abwehr received Garbo's assessment of events through the summer of 1944. The Allies were stronger than expected. American casualties were lower than German commanders had anticipated. The replacement of losses in Allied armored units was occurring at rates that suggested an industrial capacity that German assessments had been underestimating. These reports were also produced by the 20 Committee. What they described, American strength, American resilience, the gap between what German intelligence had told Hitler to expect and what was actually happening, was accurate in its broad outlines because the 20 Committee had decided that accurate reporting on American strength served Allied interests better than continued underestimation. A Germany that understood it was losing might surrender sooner. A Germany that believed it was still winning might fight longer. The choice of what to tell the Germans and when to tell them the truth was a decision that the 20 Committee made as deliberately as every other decision in the system. What the Germans chose to believe, once told, was a different matter entirely. By the autumn of 1944, the German intelligence picture of the Western Front had inverted. For 4 years, the Abwehr and SD had been feeding Hitler assessments that underestimated Allied strength, underestimated Allied resilience, and overestimated the political will of democratic governments to accept the casualties that a serious war required. The assessments had been shaped by institutional pressure, by ideological assumption, and by the specific mechanics of a double-cross system that had been producing the German picture of Britain since 1940. Now the picture was accurate, and Hitler didn't believe it. The reports coming into OKW in October and November 1944 described an American army that had recovered from the attrition of the summer fighting, that was being resupplied and reinforced at rates that German logistics could not match, and that was preparing for a winter offensive that would push through the Siegfried Line toward the Rhine. The analysts who produced these assessments were no longer working from double-agent reports. They were working from prisoners of war, from aerial reconnaissance, from signals intelligence, from the observable facts of what was happening on the ground. The observable facts were not encouraging. American divisions that had been fought to exhaustion in the Hurtgen Forest were being pulled back, refitted, and returned to the line within weeks. Replacements arrived in numbers that German division commanders found difficult to credit, not because the numbers were implausible, but because the German replacement system, by the autumn of 1944, could not produce comparable results. A German division that took heavy casualties in October stayed under strength in November. An American division that took comparable casualties in October was back at strength in November. The differential was the product of exactly what the pre-war Abwehr assessments had said was impossible: American industrial and manpower mobilization at a scale that sustained offensive operations indefinitely. Hitler's response to accurate intelligence about American strength in late 1944 was to plan a counteroffensive. The logic, as he presented it to his generals, was not entirely irrational. The Western Front was held by Allied armies that were extended across a wide front, logistically strained by the speed of their advance from Normandy, and, in the specific sector of the Ardennes, thinly covered by divisions that were either new to combat or recovering from recent fighting. A concentrated armored thrust through the Ardennes, aimed at Antwerp, could split the Allied line, capture the port that was the primary Allied supply hub, and create the conditions for a negotiated peace in the West before the Soviet winter offensive began in the East. The plan required surprise. It required the Allies to not know it was coming. The Germans achieved surprise by abandoning the signals infrastructure that Allied intelligence had been exploiting. Strict radio silence was imposed on the assembling forces. Orders were transmitted by courier. The 6th Panzer Army, the primary strike force, moved at night and remained hidden during daylight. The assembly of 28 divisions in the Eifel region, the largest German offensive operation in the West since 1940, was conducted with a security discipline that the German military had rarely maintained earlier in the war. Allied intelligence missed it. Not entirely. There were indicators, and some of them reached the right desks. Bletchley Park detected the formation of new signals networks. Aerial reconnaissance reported rail activity that exceeded what defensive operations required. A Belgian woman named Elise Delay was questioned by a German patrol, saw signs of the buildup, and reported what she had seen to American lines. Patton's intelligence officer, Oscar Koch, assessed the evidence and briefed his commander on December 9th that a German offensive in the Ardennes was probable. Koch was correct. He was also largely ignored. The Allied High Command had constructed, from its own intelligence picture, a belief that was the mirror image of the German mistake that Fortitude had exploited, the conviction that the enemy was incapable of what he was actually preparing to do. The Germans had believed the Allies would not attempt Normandy because a democratic army could not sustain the casualties. The Allies believed the Germans would not attempt the Ardennes because a defeated army could not mount a serious offensive. Both beliefs were wrong. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, 800 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. The American units holding that front were, as German planners had identified, the weakest on the Western Front. The 106th Infantry Division had been in the line for less than a week. The 28th Infantry Division was recovering from the catastrophic losses it had sustained in the Hürtgen Forest the previous month. The 4th Infantry Division, on the southern end of the sector, was similarly depleted. These were not the divisions that would be sent to hold a critical sector if Allied intelligence had correctly assessed the threat. Allied intelligence had not correctly assessed the threat. The initial German breakthrough was significant. 28 divisions, 200,000 men, 600 tanks, advanced through the fog and snow of the Ardennes with a speed and coherence that the Americans had not prepared for. The 106th Division was surrounded on the Schnee Eifel and surrendered in the largest mass capitulation of American forces since the Civil War, approximately 8,000 men. The German advance created a bulge in the Allied line 60 miles deep and 45 miles wide. In the specific sector of the breakthrough, German intelligence had been accurate. The Abwehr and SD assessments of American dispositions in the Ardennes, the location of specific divisions, their state of readiness, the thinness of their coverage of the front, had correctly identified the vulnerability that the offensive was designed to exploit. This was a different kind of intelligence work from the broad assessments of Allied capability and intention that had been going so wrong since 1942. It was tactical intelligence, collected by frontline reconnaissance, prisoner interrogation, and signals monitoring, applied to a specific operational problem. The Germans were competent at tactical intelligence. They had always been competent at tactical intelligence. What they had consistently failed at was the larger picture, the strategic assessment of Allied capability, will, and intention that should have told them, long before December 1944, that the war was lost. The Ardennes offensive was, in its strategic conception, a product of the same intelligence failure that had produced the confident assessments of 1943 and 1944. The belief that American resolve was fragile, that a sharp blow at the right moment would produce the political crisis that military defeat had not. Hitler's plan depended on the Americans reacting to the breakthrough with panic, on commanders losing their nerve, on the Allied coalition fracturing under pressure, on the democratic governments of Britain and America deciding that the cost of continuing was too high. The Americans did not panic. Within 48 hours of the breakthrough, Eisenhower had identified the Ardennes as the main German effort rather than a diversion, and had begun redirecting forces to contain it. Patton, the general whose fictional army group had held 15 German divisions at Calais for 7 weeks, turned his Third Army 90 degrees in 72 hours and drove north into the German southern flank. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne, refused to surrender. The weather cleared on December 23rd, and Allied air power, grounded since the offensive began, returned to the battlefield. By January 1945, the bulge had been eliminated. The German reserve, the last significant armored force on the Western Front, had been expended. The Siegfried Line, which the Ardennes offensive had been designed to make inviolable, was crossed by Allied forces in February. The intelligence failure that had made the Ardennes possible was real. The Americans had been surprised, and the surprise had cost them approximately 75,000 casualties in 6 weeks of fighting, the heaviest American losses of the European war. But the strategic premise of the offensive, that surprise alone could produce the political collapse that 2 years of fighting had not, was never tested, because the American military response was not what German intelligence had predicted it would be. The Abwehr had been telling Hitler for 4 years that American resolve was a fragile thing. The Ardennes told him it was not. He did not change his assessment. In March 1945, with Allied armies across the Rhine and Soviet forces closing on Berlin from the east, Hitler's intelligence briefing still described an Allied coalition on the verge of fracture, still found reasons to believe that the next German success would produce the political crisis that would end the war on acceptable terms. The briefings were wrong. They had been wrong for a long time. The intelligence system that produced them had been compromised at its foundations since 1940, and what had not been compromised by the double-cross system had been compromised by the institutional pressure to tell the leadership what it wanted to hear. The accurate picture of Allied strength existed. It had been produced by the same analysts who produced everything else. It simply did not reach Hitler in a form that he was willing to accept as true. The question the Abwehr's story poses is not why German intelligence failed. Intelligence services fail regularly, in every war, on both sides. The specific mechanisms of failure, compromised agents, institutional pressure toward confirmation, the difficulty of distinguishing accurate reporting from sophisticated deception, are not unique to Germany or to the Second World War. They are the recurring vulnerabilities of any organization that depends on information to make decisions and cannot fully verify the information it receives. The question the Abwehr story poses is why the failure was so complete, so sustained, and so consequential. The answer has 3 parts. The first is the double-cross system, the specific achievement of British intelligence in capturing and turning every German agent in Britain and maintaining that control for 5 years without a significant breach. This was not inevitable. It required skill, patience, and a quality of institutional coordination between MI5, MI6, Bletchley Park, and the service chiefs that was genuinely unusual. The Germans had capable intelligence officers. Under different circumstances, a single agent who escaped capture, a single breach in the Enigma decryption that revealed to the Germans that their communications were being read, the system might have failed. It did not fail. The completeness of British control over the German agent network in Britain was the foundation on which everything else rested. The second part is the specific vulnerability of the German system to what it was told by sources it trusted. The Abwehr's reliance on agent reports, on the human intelligence that Garbo and the other double agents provided, reflected a broader German preference for human sources over signals intelligence and analytical assessment. The British and Americans had invested heavily in signals intelligence. Bletchley Park's codebreakers, the American signals intelligence apparatus that supported operations in both theaters, the systematic analysis of intercepted communications. The Germans had invested in agents. When the agents were compromised, the investment turned against them. The third part is Hitler. An intelligence system that cannot report bad news to its leadership is an intelligence system that will eventually stop seeing bad news, not because the bad news stops occurring, but because the analysts and officers who produce assessments learn what kind of assessments survive contact with the leadership and what kind do not. The Abwehr's institutional culture, shaped by years of producing assessments that confirmed Hitler's prior beliefs, had degraded its own capacity for accurate analysis. The officers who understood that American industrial capacity was not what Hitler believed were not the officers who wrote the assessments that reached him. This was not unique to Germany. Every intelligence system that operates within a political structure faces the pressure to tell the leadership what it wants to hear. The specific intensity of that pressure in Nazi Germany, where disagreement with the Führer was not merely career-ending but potentially fatal, produced a specific intensity of degradation. Canaris had understood this. The admiral who had run the Abwehr from 1935 to 1944 had been, by the end, so disillusioned with the system he was running and the regime it served that he had become, in the judgment of his post-war interrogators, something close to a saboteur, a man who was running an intelligence service while quietly undermining its product. He was arrested in February 1944, following the July plot against Hitler's life, and executed in April 1945, 3 weeks before Germany surrendered. The Abwehr he had run was absorbed by the SD in the summer of 1944, dissolved into the organization that had been its bureaucratic rival since 1935, as punishment for the July plot and for the accumulated failures that the summer's fighting had made impossible to ignore. By then, the failures had done their work. Juan Pujol Garcia received the Iron Cross from Germany in July 1944. The decoration was awarded for his reporting on the Normandy landings, for the June 9th message that had persuaded Hitler to hold the reserve at Calais, for the consistent intelligence picture he had maintained through the critical weeks after D-Day. The Abwehr considered him the most valuable agent it had run against Britain. The Iron Cross was the highest recognition available to a civilian contributor to German military operations. Garcia also received the Member of the British Empire from King George VI in November 1944. He was, as far as is known, the only person in the Second World War to receive formal decorations from both sides for the same work. The Iron Cross was for services to Germany. The MBE was for services to Britain. The services were identical. The intelligence he had provided was the same intelligence. The Germans had paid him for destroying their strategic position in France. The British had honored him for the same destruction. After the war, Garcia disappeared. He faked his death in Angola in 1949, moved to Venezuela under a new identity, and lived quietly in Caracas for 30 years. He was afraid that surviving German intelligence networks would kill him if they discovered he had been a double agent. He did not surface publicly until 1984, when a British historian tracking the Fortitude story found him alive in Venezuela and brought him to London. He was 86 years old. He met the Duke of Edinburgh. He visited Bletchley Park. He saw, for the first time in 40 years, the files that documented what he had done. The files showed, in the specific language of intelligence assessment, what Garbo's reports had produced on the German side. The Abwehr's response traffic, the messages from Hamburg to their most trusted agent in Britain, decoded at Bletchley and read in real time by the 20 Committee, documented the degree to which the German picture of Allied intentions had been shaped by what Garcia and Harris had decided to tell them. The files showed analysts in Hamburg working confidently with information that was entirely manufactured. They showed senior officers forwarding assessments to OKW that rested on a foundation that did not exist. They showed, in sum, an intelligence service that had been seeing what it was shown. The lesson that the Abwehr story offered was not about deception specifically. Deception was the specific mechanism through which the failure had been engineered in this case, but the failure itself was older and more general. An intelligence service that cannot distinguish between what it knows and what it has been told it knows, that lacks the independent verification channels to test its own assessments, is an intelligence service that can be made to see anything. The Germans had lacked those channels because they had trusted their agents, because their agents had been compromised, and because the institutional culture that surrounded their leadership made the question of whether the assessments were accurate less important than the question of whether they were acceptable. The Americans they had been assessing, whose strength they had underestimated, whose resolve they had doubted, whose casualties they had inflated, had not performed according to the assessments. They had crossed the Channel. They had held the beachhead. They had broken out of Normandy, driven across France, crossed the Rhine, and driven to the Elbe. The gap between what German intelligence had told Hitler the Americans would do and what the Americans had actually done was visible in every mile of territory between the Normandy beaches and Berlin. Garcia, in his Caracas apartment, had known this for 30 years before he surfaced. He had known it because he had built it, in a rented room in Lisbon, from reference books and imagination, with the specific patience of a man who had decided to do something and was willing to take the time to do it correctly. The Iron Cross sat in a drawer somewhere in Venezuela. The MBE sat somewhere else. The gap between what the Abwehr knew and what was true sat in the history of the war. In the 7 weeks that 15 German divisions spent watching the sea at Calais, in the reserve that was not committed to Normandy on June 10th, in the beachhead that survived because the intelligence service of the Third Reich had trusted the wrong man completely.